I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Andrew Short. He is a marine scientist. He specialises in coastal processes, beach dynamics, and coastal geomorphology. He's worked in the coasts of pretty much everywhere, North and South America, including Northern Alaska and Hawaii, Europe, New Zealand, Korea, Africa, and the entire Australian coast. He's the author of 16 books and over 200 scientific publications. Andy's extensive contribution in both coastal science and beach safety is why in 2010 he was recognised with an Order of Australia medal. Andy's latest book, Coasts of Australia, will be given away tonight to one lucky audience member, which I'll announce at the end of the Q&A session. So without further ado, I give you Andy Short.
Hello. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening for this talk about the history of the Adelaide beaches. I might start, thanks Annabelle for your introduction also, and I might start by explaining what is a coastal geomorphologist. It's a branch of marine science that looks at the studies, the development, the morphological development and evolution of our coastline. And as it acts under the influence of waves, winds, tides, currents, and of course sea level change. And I work at timescales from hours, looking at the dynamics of beaches and rip currents, right through to millennium, when we look at the evolution of our coast over the last several thousand years since sea level rose to its present level, as is the case, we'll see in a few minutes, in the Adelaide coast. So the two slides there, you can see a nice dynamic beach over on the east coast and a shoreline that has prograded 2 kilometres seaward on the right-hand side down on the New South Wales south coast, quite close to where I live. As Annabelle said, I've worked all over the place. I've had fortunate to work up in North Alaska, where I actually did my PhD. I was recently over in Korea. That's a demilitarized zone behind us, a real no man's land. Beautiful beaches though. I spent a lot of time in Brazil. In fact, I wrote a book on a Brazilian coast 4 years ago. That's at the mouth of the Amazon. And I've done a tremendous amount of work in South Australia. That slide there, recently over on the Bunda Cliffs on the Nullarbor. So you might wonder what someone from New South is doing talking about the Adelaide beaches. But my association with South Australia scientifically goes back to the 1980s. We came over from the University of Sydney and to investigate the dynamics of a high energy beach, and Goolwa Beach in South Australia is one of the highest energy beaches in the world. And we set up camp there in the dunes in 1980 and instrumented the surf zone with waves and current meters, did a tremendous study of how these systems operate, the dynamics of such systems. Subsequent to that, I was invited back in to do the Southeast report in '84, followed by the Eyre Peninsula and Kangaroo Island reports, published in '86. I was on the Minister's Review of the Adelaide beaches back in the late '90s. I wrote a book on all of the South Australian beaches, including KI, published in 2001. I did a report for the DEW on the impact of sea level rise, potential impact on the Coorong Barrier, 2009. I did a book chapter on the management of the Adelaide beaches in 2013. And my most recent book came out early this year. Is 4 chapters on Southeast, Kangaroo Island, the Gulfs, Eyre Peninsula and the Nullarbor coast. Actually 5 chapters. And I've also, I'm involved with the National Surfing Reserves Australia, and I've been involved in the dedication of surfing reserves over on the Eyre in Point Sinclair, in Adelaide on the mid-coast, and presently one is being developed in Encounter Bay. I'm also presently working, as I mentioned, on over on the Bunda Cliffs, looking at the evolution of the clifftop dunes that cover hundreds of kilometres of the cliffs of a Great Australian Bight. So I've had a long and fairly broad association with the South Australian coast, which is, of course, one of my favourite coasts in Australia. So what's happening in Adelaide? You can see here this part of the South Australian coast. We have the 2 peninsulas, the Fleurieu and York, Kangaroo Island down the bottom. And so the Gulf St Vincent is somewhat protected by Kangaroo Island, and it requires swell to come through Investigator Strait there, in that diagram, arriving from the south-southwest, assisted also by the prevailing south to southwest winds and wind waves. It generates a wave train, a wave climate that pushes sand northwards along the eastern Plurier Peninsula, all the way from Rapid Bay right up along the coast to Outer Harbour and beyond. That red arrow in particular indicates where sand is being moved and has been moved continuously along the Adelaide section of the coast. So this is the crux of the whole issue, is that we have this very dynamic coastal system, and it's been dynamic since sea level reached its present level some 7,000 years ago. You can see here in this work of Bowman and Harvey, they dated the age of the Adelaide coast, and you can see the yellow arrow indicating sand moving along the coast. And if you're here 7,000 years ago, as obviously the First Nation people were, you wouldn't have, Adelaide coast would have been quite different. It would have terminated at about Glenelg. And all that land north of Glenelg, but what known as the Lefevre Peninsula, did not exist at that time. It was just open water. As sand moved northwards along the coast, it built the beaches both inland and also northwards, reaching Tennyson about 7,000 years ago, Semaphore by 6,000 years ago, Largs Bay 5,000, and then slowing down not to reach Osborne by about 2,000 years ago, and only reaching the Outer Harbour in the last few hundred years. So this is a very, geologically speaking, a very new coast, and it continues to be a very dynamic coast. Unfortunately, that sand that has been transported northwards, we are running out of a source to the south. It is diminishing supply, but the rate at which it is being transported is maintained. In fact, it's increasing slightly. And so there's a deficiency of sand in that whole system. You'll see here the Lefevre Peninsula, a photo taken 80 years ago. And before it was developed heavily, you can see those ridges there with those yellow arrows paralleling some of those ridges, and the arrows indicating both the ridges and the direction of sand transport. Each of those ridges indicates a former position of a shoreline. They're called a beach ridge. And as the sand moved northwards, it built ridges northwards. They curved around in towards the Outer Harbour there, and building the peninsula both into the Gulf and also northwards. And that's how this whole Adelaide coast has been built from Glenelg northwards in the last 7,000 years. And that sand is continuing to move along at the present day. So you can see as an impact of this, here we see Largs Bay in 1936. And if you look at it today, you can see the tremendous amount of accretion or the progradation of a shoreline as a result of the accumulation of sand towards the northern end of the system, partly assisted by the construction of this build out by North Harbour. It's stopping the sand moving into Outer Harbour. So the shoreline is building both northwards and also into the Gulf, as is very evident in that slide. So while this is a natural system, has been operating for several thousand years, regrettably, in the last couple of hundred years, since European settlement of the coast, we've had a lot of bad impacts. First of all, there was clearing of the dunes in the coastal plain for development. The clearing of the dunes allowed even more sand to blow inland and being lost from the system. The dunes were levelled and for housing, quarried for construction and aggregate. There was development right on the beaches and on the former dunes, too close to the beaches. And these ones suffered periodic storm damage and erosion. And as a result of that storm damage and erosion, a range of structures are built, seawalls, groynes, breakwaters, and so on. And these further impinged upon the beach and sand transport, further exacerbating the problem rather than solving it. In addition, as Adelaide grew and its wastewater and it was discharged into the Gulf, we had pollution of the rivers and streams, and the construction of the outfalls at Glenelg and Torrens in the 1930s pumped that right into the Gulf, which the introduction of nutrient-rich water led to the growth of algae on the seagrass, which has died back. We had dieback of the inner seagrass meadows. As they've died back, there's been less filtering of a wave energy, higher waves are reaching the coast. As a result, even more sand is moving northwards along the coast. So we've had a lot of adverse impacts in the last couple of 100 years. So you can see here at Seacliff, houses built right onto the beach, the dunes destabilised and blowing inland. We see here at Brighton, the road right on the running right through the sand dunes. There's dunes all been scarped and destabilised. Breakwaters and jetties built across the beach as well. Yeah, tremendous human impact on the coastal system and on the coastal dune system. So by the 1960s, the coast was in a bad way. You can see in the photos there, houses built precariously close to the beach and suffering the consequences when storm erosion occurs. There was, two of the 60s, actually to the 70s, there was only ad hoc crisis management in response to these issues. No overall management plan. Unplanned structures littered the coast. The pollution was impacting the seagrass meadows. The dunes were unmanaged and unstable. Sand supply was insufficient to maintain the beaches and dunes, and consequently the beaches and dunes were eroding. Property and infrastructure, you can see very clearly in those slides, was at risk, and beach amenity for public use was greatly diminished. Imagine going to the beach on the bottom right there. So the beaches were in a bad way. You can see here other examples of Glenelg following storms in 53, massive damage to the foreshore there. And down at Henley Beach, also the same storm, massive damage, destruction of a seawall, undermining of a road and beachfront houses. So by the end of the 60s, it was realised something needed to be done. And so the state government commissioned the Culver Report. Bob Culver, a coastal engineer at the University of Adelaide, secondly, we need to nourish the beaches. The beaches don't have enough sand. And we also need to maintain what coastal sand reserves we do have, particularly the coastal sand dunes. So something clearly had to be done. In response to that report, the state government set up in 1972 the Coast Protection Board that exists to this day. And as Annabelle said, she's the newest member. The policy back then, and has continued to this day, has been to, first of all, look at sand recycling. In other words, use the excess of sand at the northern end of the compartment to move it further back down to the southern end where there's a deficiency. Even then, there's still not enough sand in the system, and so then look for sand outside of the system from either offshore in deeper water or onshore sources, and this is put in the system called sand nourishment. So there are two key sources of sand: the backpassing of existing sand and nourishment from outside. To assist the backpassing, to engage in sand trapping, which already occurs at breakwaters, but also the detached breakwater semaphore has been very successful as a mechanism for trapping the sand, so it can be then trucked or piped southwards. To bypass the sand where it's being held up by structures like at Glenelg and West Beach, so it can continue to move naturally along the coast. To develop better designed seawalls that don't fail when there's storms, and help minimise erosion, and also, very importantly, to monitor the entire system, not just the beaches and dunes, but also the seagrass meadows. Because it's only by monitoring can you know how effective your management program has been, and therefore fine-tune it to better adjust to changing conditions. So here we see some more slides. Glenelg Beach in 2005, we're now still trucking sand from Glenelg to the northern side of the inlet. That's now sent over by dredge and pipeline. But while trucking is a very effective mechanism of doing it, it's rather unsightly, it's noisy, and it's not cost efficient, and it's not very good for the environment. So In 2005, it was a new strategy was developed, or not a new, but an outgrowth of the existing policies and the monitoring program following these major studies. And it was basically a continuous strategy of sand recycling and beach nourishment, but to improve its efficiency and reduce the disruption by using pipelines rather than trucks. As I said, trucks are effective, but they're not either cost effective, environmentally effective, and generally people don't like trucks roaring up and down their streets. Pipelines are buried, they're silent, they're quite effective, very effective. And this has proven effective so far for the southern beaches, but where the pipeline was implemented, but it hasn't been fully implemented. It hasn't been implemented on the northern beaches. So trucks are still being used north of West Beach. And this is one of the major issues facing us at the moment, is the need to replace these trucks with a better system. So here we see the impact of the nourishment or the backpassing down at Seacliff before. The beach very narrow, right back to the seawall and the dune escarped. And after nourishment and backpassing, we have a nice wide beach, a natural vegetated foredune, and everything that goes with it. So just summing up at this stage, we can say that the geological setting of the Adelaide beaches means that they are out of equilibrium with prevailing wind and wave climate. In other words, more sand is wanting to move along the system than is available to move. Historical development has locked up some of the sand. When you build seawalls, when you build groynes, breakwaters, you stop sand from being used by the natural system. So sand recycling, or also called backpassing, combined with periodic nourishment, is the best way to maintain the Adelaide beaches. And it's an approach that is used not only elsewhere in Australia, but is used around the world. Now, the details of what is proposed, I won't be going into here. They're going to be the subject of a future webinar called Securing the Future of the Adelaide Coastline. So those details will be the subject of that future webinar. I'll just touch on a couple of slides here showing elsewhere in Australia where sand bypassing or backpassing is used as a solution for the interruption to longshore sand transport. First one is in Port Brevard over in Western Australia. When they built the Dawes Canal, it's called there, to open a Peel Inlet to the ocean and improve water quality in the Peel Inlet. Very successful program. They realised the training walls there were going to trap sand, so they built in that little hook groyne on the right there, put a permanent dredge in there, and they pumped sand under the Peel Inlet or Port Brevard from the southern side to the northern side, so they can maintain the beaches to the north of those training walls. A very successful project was planned at the planning stage and implemented as soon as the walls were built. It's been very successful ever since. On an even bigger scale, over on the Gold Coast, 32 kilometres long, and it is the most highly managed section of coast, I'd say, definitely in Australia, and it's probably in the world. Very heavily managed. They can afford to do it. They can afford to spend millions of dollars a year because they have the support of a massive tourist industry there. And at the southern end here at the Tweed, that's in New South Wales, south of the Tweed River entrance there, Queensland to the north. We have the Tweed River entrance. When it was built in 1967, it trapped sand on the southern side and caused a loss of sand on the Gold Coast and erosion of the Gold Coast beaches. So in 2000, the New South Wales government agreed to pump sand from New South Wales to Queensland free of charge. 500,000 cubic meters a year of New South Wales goes to Queensland every year. It cost them about $10 million a year. And that's been going on ever since. It has restored the southern Gold Coast beaches and maintained the natural flow of sand along the Gold Coast. It doesn't stop there. You can see there where the sand is pumped from the jetty there on the southern side under the Tweed River and comes out at Snapper Rocks there on the northern side. They do it at night, most nights. At the northern end of the Gold Coast, 32 k's to the north, we have the Seaway, which was built to stabilise what was previously the Nerang entrance there. It was built in 1986. They knew at the time they were going to stop the sand moving along the coast and onto South Stradbroke Island. So they implemented at the time of construction another jetty there, you might just make out. And they pumped sand, that bottom arrow, from that jetty under the Seaway to South Stradbroke Island to maintain the sand, 500,000 cubic metres a year, to maintain the sand on Stradbroke Island, and it then moves up Stradbroke Island up towards North Stradbroke Island to maintain the natural flow of sand from New South Wales into Queensland, from the Gold Coast in onto South Stradbroke Island. They still had some minor issues down near Surfers Paradise Beach, in that triangle there. It's where they constructed an offshore breakwater, submerged breakwater, in 1999. Unfortunately, it's submerged deeper into the sand than they expected and hasn't been very effective. And so there's still some issues on Surfers Paradise Beach, and so their most recent project, which commenced this year, the sand backpassing program, that arrow to the top arrow, takes sand from the pumping jetty southwards via a pipeline, you'll see in the next slide, to Surfers Paradise Beach. You can see a schematic of it here. You can see the black arrows at the top of the pumping jetty and the sand going under the Seaway onto South Stradbroke Island. The red line is the buried backpassing pipeline that runs along the spit at the back of that park there, and down along the back of the beach, right down to Surfers Paradise Beach, main beach. You see the blue arrow, yellow arrow, continue all the way down to Cavill Avenue on Surfers Paradise Beach. It's 8 kilometres long, it's buried, it's permanent, and it has several outlets onto the beach, so they can fine-tune the placement of sand on the beach, which is normally done preferably in the winter months and when there's away from the peak tourist season. And that's proving very effective in maintaining the width of the section of beach along Surfers Paradise, Narrow Neck, main beach, and along the spit. So that's, I think, the closest approximation to what is being proposed for the Adelaide coast. Some people think maybe structures might be a good idea. Well, there already are plenty of structures on the Adelaide coast. Regrettably, they're not very sightly and they're not great for public amenity. The newer seawalls are better designed. The older seawalls, as I said earlier, were fairly poor, often failed. But the global trend in Australia and internationally is to use nourishment and beach replenishment. Instead of hard engineering structures like groynes and seawalls and breakwaters, to use natural replenishment, natural sand, either recycled sand or nourished sand, to maintain a natural beach and foredune. Even the Dutch, the famous Dutch engineers, most engineered coast in the world, are now doing sand nourishment on an absolutely massive scale, even bigger than the Gold Coast. So any structures that are built, however, must be combined with replenishment to prefill and manage downdrift impacts. And that's why at West Beach and Glenelg we have bypassing of those systems to allow the sand to continue moving along the coast. Also, submerged geotextile structures have been proposed. As I just showed, the one on the Gold Coast failed for various reasons. They also can increase the risk of erosion through wave refraction and generation of rip currents. And personally, I'm not aware of any successful examples of those systems. So just to sum up some final comments, I see these two slides, both of the Adelaide coast, one in the south, where obviously there's not enough sand, and one in the north, where there's obviously too much sand. And what we want to do is balance out that inequity in sand along the coast. So I've had the opportunity to see coastal management in operation on many of the world's coasts throughout the UK, Europe, North and South America, Africa, and Asia. I've also worked around the entire Australian coast, not only in South Australia, but I've been heavily involved in New South Wales. I was on the New South Wales Coastal Panel for the last 10 years, advising the Minister for the Environment on coastal issues. On Queensland, particularly on the Gold Coast, and most recently in their sand backpassing system, I was asked to write a report on potential impacts of that backpassing system on the beaches. And with this knowledge of both in Australia and globally, I can certainly say that Australia is a world leader in coastal management, and in general has the best protected and best managed beaches in the world. We're a very fortunate country in that regard. We do have very good coastal managers in every state in Australia and even at a federal level. South Australia led the way in Australia in coastal management, both in Australia and internationally, with the establishment of a Coast Protection Board in 1972, the first of its type in Australia, one of the very first of its types in the world. And so, and as a result of that early start, it's been a world leader in coastal management in Australia and internationally. And so you're very fortunate to have such a good, effective board and department, managing your coast, not just in Adelaide, but the whole South Australian coast. So from the beginning, the Coast Protection Board adopted a whole of system approach. It didn't just look at individual shires and what was going on here in Glenelg or elsewhere. It looked at the entire Adelaide coast, the entire sort of east coast of the Fleurier Peninsula, and what was the best way to manage that system, given that it is one continuous system, sand is moving through it, and had been severely impacted by European impacts in the last couple of hundred years. So it's this approach to managing the entire system was only adopted on the Gold Coast 4 years later in 1976, and only adopted in policy in West Australia and New South Wales only 2 years ago in 2018. So as I said, South Australia is well ahead of the game in its management of the Adelaide coast. So basically, in order to maintain the Adelaide beach systems, if you want to have nice, healthy, wide beaches along the entire system, we need more sand in the system. And that sand needs to come from both backpassing, bringing excess sand in the north back further south, and also from outside or from nourishment when required. Now, the most effective way, both in terms of cost, environment and social impacts, to move sand around is not by trucks, but via a buried pipeline, as they're doing as we speak on the Gold Coast. So with that, I'll finish and say, I think you've got a tremendous coastline there in Adelaide. It needs to be maintained. It should be maintained not only to protect the coast and its integrity, but also for the people of Adelaide and visitors. So I hope in a future webinar you'll hear about the details of what's proposed and how to do this. But from my opinion, I'd certainly support the backpassing from the northern part of the coast. Okay. Well, thanks very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Andy. That's such a great history lesson of the Adelaide beaches. For me, it was really great to see those historical photos. It was just a reminder to me that coastal erosion and having to respond to it is something we've been dealing with since early settlement, not just in the last couple of decades. And just to also get that insight into management practices elsewhere, it just provides that confirmation that the current practices in the state are in line with industry best practice. So thank you. So we now have the opportunity to put some questions to Andy. So thank you to those who have put them in the chat function throughout the session. We're going to start with a question from Stephen and Chris. I'm going to combine these together actually. So the question, Andy, is when are groynes more likely to be utilised? And more specifically, should we have more structures such as the Bower Road breakwater?
I'm not familiar with that breakwater, but yeah, the first thing, when groynes should groynes be utilised?
Yes, I guess the general question is, should we use more structures?
Groynes are a no-no. The Dutch stopped using groynes about 100 years ago. So the only thing groynes do is they accumulate sand on one side, but sand is eroded on the other side. When there's a storm, they generate rips that transport the sand that has accumulated offshore into deeper water where it may be lost from the system. So groynes disrupt the sand transport. generate localised erosion and result in more sand being transported offshore out of the system. I'm unfortunately not familiar, not being a local, with that other breakwater that was mentioned, so I can't answer that one.
Yeah, fair. I think I'll move on to the second question. Is from Stephen. Is the pumping of sand natural or mechanical? Well, I can answer that. It's mechanical. But if it's mechanical, what does it sound and look like? Well, I guess I'll say to Stephen is that there's actually bypassing happening in Glenelg at the minute. So you're welcome to go down and have a look. Is there anything else, Andy, you wanted to add to that? In terms of,
I think just go visit Glenelg and hear for yourself.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And now a question from Amy. Where do we draw the line between stopping northern longshore drift versus allowing these natural processes to occur? So I guess what Amy's asking there is, so where do we draw the line between stopping northern longshore drift with sand transport and seawalls versus allowing these natural processes to occur? Is it purely so it doesn't affect humans? If so, where do we draw the line?
Well, we've already drawn the line at North Harbour. We stopped the sand that would have originally moved around the Lefevre Peninsula into North Harbour. We'll stop there with the construction of the training walls for the harbour and also that North Harbour Marina further south. So we've already stopped it. As a result of that stopping, the sand is building out considerably against those training walls and jetties. So something has to be done. The natural system has been interrupted. The most effective use to make of that sand, unless you wanted to build right out to the end of the jetties and start moving into North Harbour and blocking the harbour, is to take some of it back down south, where it can replenish the beaches, but have a deficiency of sand.
Okay, thanks. Andy, a question from Elizabeth. What impact is climate change likely to have on the coastal system? She's specifically asking in regards to sea level rise.
Yeah, well, the department has done modelling of that, where as sea level rises, the water will get deeper. It allows bigger waves to reach the coast. Bigger waves reaching the coast, it accelerates the transport of sand along the coast. So we expect sand transport to increase, to accelerate, which means looking into the future, we're going to have to do more backpassing, perhaps more nourishment to maintain the system into the future.
Okay, thank you. And just a question from, I'm not sure who this one's from, is Jared. Is sand pumping the best and only solution, or do we still need to find a large, ideally sustainable mass source of sand replenishment?
Well, at the moment, sand pumping is the best. To find another source for sand replenishment would have to be, I assume, from offshore. If it could be found, it would still have to be dredged and pumped on shore. So it's not mechanically moved from its source to the beaches. So whichever way you look at it, the sand has to move one way or another.
Thank you. Just bear with me while I'm getting the questions. This one's from Julianne. How long does it take for sand to replenish on the northern beaches after it's removed?
I can't answer that specifically. Perhaps you can, Annabelle, but it depends how fast you pump it. You can pump it as fast as you like, so it depends on the speed, but I assume it'll be pumped at a rate that maintains the beaches. But that's something, again, more a question for the next webinar. Yeah,
sure, fair enough. I've just got a couple for myself, I suppose. Have there been any negative impacts of the permanent sand pumping system to Gold Coast?
Well, it's only initiated this year, and so far it's been quite successful. But they do manage it on a daily basis, because it's one of the, except for during the virus period, it's one of Australia's most popular beach, and they're very aware of the impact on the beach population. So they do monitor it continuously, both its impact on the beach, potential impact on the surf, on public safety, and so it is highly regulated and highly monitored.
And how long can we keep pumping sand with the impacts of climate change?
I think forever. The sand's going to keep, it's been moving along for the last 7,000 years. It's going to keep moving along so long as sea level stays roughly its present position for the next few thousand years too. So for the foreseeable lifetime, we'll need to be doing it. I'd say for the next decades to centuries, it'll be necessary.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just checking to see if there's any that you can specifically answer. We can see a lot of questions coming in that are very specific to the Metropolitan Coast, which we would plan to answer in future webinars. We're trying to just pick questions tonight that Andy will be able to answer. So this one's from Sam. Do you think restoring seagrass meadows would have a significant impact in slowing longshore drift?
It would. It'd be great to restore seagrass meadows, and they are attempting to do that, but it does take time. Your time taken to restore them to their former extent is going to take decades or even longer. So whilst it's a great solution, it will slow down the waves, it will slow down the transport. It can't be done overnight, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And can you take a question about New South Wales, please? If you, from Dorothy, if you wish, you can you tell me what is happening on Stockton Beach?
Stockton Beach. Oh, that's for people who don't know Stockton Beach, that's on the northern side of Newcastle Harbour. There's two big training walls at Newcastle Harbour, which stop sand moving onto Stockton Beach. So Stockton Beach is a combination of the starvation of sand moving from the south to the north because of the Newcastle Harbour training walls. In addition, north of Stockton Beach, there's the biggest active sand dunes in New South Wales, the Stockton Dunes. There's loss of sand into those dunes. So the beach itself is receding due to lack of sand coming from the south, and particularly loss of sand into the sand dunes. And so it's a double whammy. And so Stockton Beach is no longer a beach, it's just a continuous seawall. And like a few other beaches in New South Wales, you may have seen on the news, was impacted a couple of weeks ago by a big East Coast cyclone we had.
Okay, thanks, Andy. We have had other questions, but they are more specific to the Adelaide Living Beaches project, or Adelaide more specific, that Andy wouldn't be able to answer. So we are, as I said, planning to address those in future webinars. But that's all we have time for tonight. But firstly, I'd like to personally thank Andy for being a part of this evening, sharing your knowledge and expertise with us as a leading expert in coastal management. It's really appreciated. And before we go, I'm pleased to announce a lucky recipient of Andy's book, Coast of Australia, goes to Julie Tennant. So we'll be in touch with you, Julie, after the session to arrange sending it out to you. That's the book. So also thank you for everyone for participating tonight and putting in your questions. And if you have enjoyed it, please look out for future events. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.